bear it. None of them would be in a sovereign country today if the French army had not been deployed in this region.
Have you ever seen one word set an entire movement in motion? One single comment that doesn't just spark outrage, but opens old wounds, brings buried histories back to the surface, and challenges the balance of global power? That's what happened when French President Emmanuel Macron used the word ungrateful to describe African leaders. He even went on to say that if Africa is surviving now, it's because of Paris. Now let us be clear, this wasn't just a slip of the tongue. His words carried centuries of meaning. It wasn't just a criticism. It was a reminder of how Africa has been viewed by its former colonizers for generations. But here's the difference. This time, Africa didn't stay silent. Enter Ibrahim Traoré, the unapologetic and fearless leader of Burkina Faso. Traoré didn't just respond. He ignited a global conversation about respect, history, and what true independence looks like. So, what did Macron say? How did Traoré's fiery response change the narrative? And why is this moment so important for Africa's future? Here, we would like to take a moment and thank you for supporting us and being a valued part of our strong community. And if you are not yet a member, we encourage you to join us and help build an even stronger community together. Let's get started. Let's start with the moment that sets everything in motion. French President Emmanuel Macron stood before the world and accused African leaders of being ungrateful for the military support France has provided. On the surface, it might sound like a frustrated comment.
Jadema is fuming over the recent remarks made by the French President Emmanuel Macron at a foreign policy conference. Macron not just dismissed suggestions that his country had been forced out of the Sahel region, he went on further to say that he is still waiting for the Sahel nations to thank Paris for stopping them from falling into the hands of Islamist militants. The French president even called some African leaders ungrateful.
2. We had a secure relationship. In truth, it was of two kinds. One part was our commitment to fighting terrorism since 2013. We were right. I think some have forgotten to say thank you, but that's okay, it'll come in time. I'm in a good position to know that ingratitude is a disease that cannot be transmitted to humans. But I say this for all the African governments who have not had the courage, in the eyes of their public opinion, to bear it. None of them would be in a sovereign country today if the French army had not been deployed in this region.
But when you peel back the layers, it's so much more. Firstly, the word ungrateful was more than just an insult. It was loaded with centuries of condescension and entitlement. Macron wasn't just implying that Africa owes France for its so-called assistance. He was suggesting that this debt is eternal and that Africa should remain thankful forever. But here's the real question: support for whom? When you take a closer look at France's involvement in Africa, it becomes painfully obvious that this support has rarely, if ever, been about genuinely helping African nations. Instead, it has consistently served France's interests. Whether it's about political influence, access to resources, or maintaining its status as a global power, France's actions have been less about partnership and more about control. Let's start with the military support Macron loves to talk about. French troops have been stationed in several African countries, supposedly to fight insurgency and stabilize the region. That sounds noble, right? But here's the thing. Look at the track record. Countries like Mali and Burkina Faso, which hosted French military bases for years, are still grappling with significant security challenges. Insurgent groups have grown stronger, not weaker. Civilians continue to live under constant threat, and local governments have struggled to maintain order. So, here's the uncomfortable truth. This military presence hasn't solved the problem. If anything, it's prolonged. Why? Because the presence of French troops often does more to protect France's interests than to address the root causes of instability. These troops secure strategic regions, ensuring that France maintains access to vital resources like uranium, gold, and oil. They position themselves as a buffer, not for African nations, but for France's energy and economic needs. Let's talk about Niger, for example. Niger is one of the world's largest producers of uranium, a resource that powers France's nuclear energy industry. French troops in Niger don't just fight insurgency, They protect the mines and trade routes that keep uranium flowing to France. And guess who benefits the most from this arrangement? Certainly not the people of Niger, who still face widespread poverty and poor infrastructure despite the wealth of their land. And this is the story of every African nation. And it doesn't stop there. France's military presence also serves a geopolitical purpose. By stationing troops in Africa, France maintains its image as a global power, a country capable of influencing events far beyond its borders. But this influence often comes at the expense of African nations, whose sovereignty is undermined by the constant presence of foreign forces. Now, ask yourself this: if France's military involvement truly benefited African nations, wouldn't we see significant improvements in security and stability by now? Instead, what we see are governments and citizens growing increasingly frustrated, accusing France of being more of a hindrance than a help. This is why Macron's word ungrateful stings so much. It's a word that erases the complexities of the relationship, reducing it to a one-sided narrative where France is the hero and Africa is the helpless recipient. But the reality is far different. France's so-called support has often been about creating dependency, not independence. It's about ensuring that African nations remain under France's influence, unable to fully chart their paths. So when Macron demands gratitude, it's not just tone-deaf, it's a reminder of a deeper imbalance. Here's a reminder to please like and share the video and subscribe to our channel to watch more videos on Black culture, history, civilization, and identity. Let's continue now. Macron's comment wasn't just about frustration, it was about power.
To thank Paris for stopping them from falling into the hands of Islamist militants. The French president even called some African leaders ungrateful.
2. We had a secure relationship. In truth, it was of two kinds. One part was our commitment to fighting terrorism since 2013. We were right. I think some have forgotten to say thank you, but that's okay, it'll come in time. I'm in a good position to know that ingratitude is a disease that cannot be transmitted to humans. But I say this for all the African governments who have not had the courage, in the eyes of their public opinion, to bear it. None of them would be in a sovereign country today if the French army had not been deployed in this region.
Many say these comments by the French president were not just condescending.
France's influence in Africa is waning. Over the past few years, countries like Mali, Niger, and Burkina Faso have rejected French troops, signaling a broader rejection of neocolonialism. Macron's words were an attempt to push back against this growing resistance, but instead of reasserting France's position, they exposed just how desperate that position has become. And then came Traoré, ready to challenge not just Macron's words, but the entire system they represent. How did Traoré respond? Traoré didn't waste time sugarcoating his response. When Macron described African leaders as ungrateful, Traoré called it exactly what it was: insulting and disrespectful. But he didn't stop there. He went further, delivering a statement that cut through the noise like a blade. We are not human beings in his eyes. Now let that sink in. Those 8 words carried the weight of centuries of history and struggle. Traoré wasn't just reacting to a careless remark. He was calling out a mindset that has lingered for far too long. It's a mindset that views Africa not as an equal partner, but as something to be managed, controlled, and judged. Macron's words may have been spoken in frustration, but they revealed a deeper truth. To many in the West, Africa is still seen through the lens of colonialism. Traoré's response wasn't just about Burkina Faso, it was about defending the dignity of the entire African continent. He wasn't speaking as a lone voice. He was channeling the frustrations of millions of Africans who have endured generations of exploitation, marginalization, and condescension. Macron's comment was a reminder of how often Africa has been treated as a problem to be solved, rather than a continent of vibrant nations with their strengths and potential. And here's the thing. Traoré didn't try to soften his message to appease anyone. He wasn't concerned about being diplomatic or avoiding offense. Instead, he spoke with the raw honesty of someone who had simply had enough. His words were direct, unapologetic, and delivered with a clarity that left no room for misinterpretation. This wasn't just about rejecting an insult. It was about reclaiming respect. What made Traoré's response so powerful wasn't just what he said, but how deeply it resonated. Across Africa, people heard his words and thought, finally, someone is saying it out loud. This wasn't just a moment of defiance, it was a rallying cry. Traoré's statement reflected a collective sentiment that had been simmering beneath the surface for decades. The frustration of being told to be grateful for scraps while Africa's resources, labor, and ingenuity fuel the wealth of others. For so long, African nations have been expected to accept their place in a system designed to benefit everyone but themselves. Leaders have been pressured to conform, to play by rules written by those who profit from Africa's subservience. But Traoré's response broke through that narrative. He made it clear that Africa doesn't need to apologize for demanding respect or for standing up against those who seek to exploit it. And his message wasn't just heard, it was felt. Traoré became a voice for a new generation of Africans who were no longer willing to be patronized. His words carried a sense of pride and self-worth, reminding the world that Africa is not a charity case, nor a subordinate to Western powers. This wasn't just a moment for Burkina Faso, it was a moment for the entire continent. Traoré's response was a bold declaration that Africa's dignity is non-negotiable. It wasn't just about pushing back against Macron. It was about redefining the narrative. In that moment, Traoré reminded everyone, Africa and the world alike, that Africa is done playing the role of the grateful recipient. It's time for Africa to stand tall, unapologetic, and demand the respect it has always deserved. In the end, Traoré didn't just call out France, he had a suggestion for them too. And what he said wasn't just bold, it shook leaders across the globe. His words carried the weight of history, and they hit like a thunderclap. If anyone is ungrateful, it's France. They owe their existence to our ancestors. Now, let's take a moment to unpack that. Because this wasn't just a fiery clapback, it was a statement of fact. France's wealth and power didn't appear out of thin air. It wasn't built in isolation or through sheer effort alone. No, it was built on the backs of African people and the vast resources of the African continent. For centuries, Africa was the foundation of Europe's prosperity, and France was no exception. First, consider the labor of enslaved Africans. During the transatlantic slave trade, millions of Africans were forcibly taken from their homes and sent to plantations, factories, and colonies, which fueled European economies. Their unpaid labor didn't just create wealth for European elites, it laid the groundwork for the industrial revolutions that transformed the West into a global power. France was a major player in this system, and its colonies in Africa and the Caribbean were among its most profitable ventures. But slavery was only the beginning. During the colonial era, France exploited Africa's vast natural resources: gold, diamonds, oil, timber, and more. These resources were extracted at an astonishing scale, enriching France while leaving African communities impoverished. Take Senegal, for example, whose peanut exports were used to fuel French industries, or Niger, where uranium mines have powered France's nuclear energy for decades. Even today, the wealth extracted from Africa during colonial rule remains a cornerstone of France's global standing. And then there's the human cost during the World Wars. France called upon its African colonies to supply soldiers for its military campaigns in both World War I and World War II. These African troops, often referred to as tirailleurs sénégalais, fought and died on foreign battlefields, not for their own countries but to protect and expand the French Empire. They endured harsh conditions, discrimination, and the ultimate sacrifice, yet their contributions are rarely acknowledged. How many of us are taught about the thousands of African soldiers who died at Verdun on the Western Front or in the deserts of North Africa? How often do we hear their stories in history books or see their names honored in French memorials? Their sacrifices have been overshadowed, minimized, or outright ignored in the broader narrative of European history. So when Traoré said, "France owes its existence to our ancestors," he wasn't exaggerating. He was reminding the world of a truth that's often been erased or downplayed. His words weren't just about setting the record straight, they were a demand for recognition. He was saying, if you want to talk about gratitude, let's start with the debt France owes to Africa. What makes this statement even more powerful is the fact that it challenges the narrative France has long promoted about its relationship with Africa. For decades, France has positioned itself as a benefactor, framing its involvement in Africa as an act of generosity, whether through aid, military assistance, or cultural exchanges. But Traoré's words turned that narrative on its head. He exposed the imbalance, the one-sidedness, and the hypocrisy at the heart of that relationship. Traoré's statement wasn't just about words, it was about dignity. It was about reclaiming Africa's place in history, not as a continent that should feel grateful, but as one that deserves recognition, respect, and justice. It was a reminder that Africa isn't just a passive recipient of European help. It's a continent whose sacrifices and contributions have shaped the world in profound ways. But here's what sets Traoré apart. He doesn't stop at words. He's a leader who believes in action, and his leadership in Burkina Faso is a testament to that belief. Under his watch, the country isn't just demanding recognition, it's actively breaking away from the systems that have kept it dependent. From expelling French troops to rethinking economic policies, Traoré is turning his words into reality. This is why Traoré's statement reverberated far beyond Burkina Faso. It wasn't just a critique of Macron's words, it was a declaration of a new era for Africa. An era where the continent no longer accepts being lectured or patronized. An era where leaders like Traoré are unafraid to speak truth to power and challenge the status quo. At that moment, Traoré wasn't just speaking for Burkina Faso, he was speaking for a continent that's tired of being told to be grateful for crumbs while its resources and labor have built empires. He was speaking for a new generation of Africans who are ready to reclaim their history, their dignity, and their future. And perhaps that's why his words hit so hard. They weren't just a response, they were a reckoning. A reminder that the story of Africa and France isn't about charity or gratitude, it's about debt. And Traoré made it clear that it's time for that debt to be acknowledged. Now, you must be wondering, why does Macron seem so defensive? The answer is simple. France has a lot to lose. For decades, Africa has been central to France's global standing, acting as a cornerstone of its economy, energy security, and geopolitical influence. Without its ties to Africa, France's power and prestige would be severely diminished. France's reliance on Africa isn't just about raw materials, it's also about markets. African countries represent a huge consumer base for French goods and services. From cars and electronics to luxury brands like Chanel and Louis Vuitton, French products dominate many African markets. This isn't by accident, it's by design. Through trade agreements and economic policies established during the colonial era, France has ensured that its companies have an outsized presence in African economies. Losing influence in Africa would mean losing access to these lucrative markets, which would be a significant blow to France's economy. Losing its foothold in Africa doesn't just weaken France's position, it shifts the balance of power. As African nations assert their independence and develop stronger regional ties, the continent is becoming a rising force in global politics. Initiatives like the African Continental Free Trade Area, AfCFTA, and increasing collaboration within the African Union are signs that Africa is moving toward greater self-reliance and unity. This shift challenges the traditional power dynamics that have kept France and the West at the center of global decision-making. And this is exactly why Macron's comment wasn't just about Burkina Faso, it was about France's growing anxiety. Macron's frustration isn't simply a reaction to one country rejecting French influence. It's a response to a broader trend that threatens to upend a relationship that has long benefited France far more than it has benefited Africa. So, where does this leave us? Leaders like Traoré are showing the world that Africa isn't just rising, it's reclaiming its resources, its dignity, and its place on the global stage. This isn't just a political movement, it's a cultural shift. It's about Africa telling its own story, on its terms. And it's not just about rejecting old power dynamics, it's about building something better. A future where African nations are united, self-reliant, and focused on their growth. What's most exciting is the ripple effect this is creating. Traoré's actions are inspiring a new generation of leaders and citizens who are ready to challenge the status quo. They're proving that Africa doesn't need to rely on anyone else to thrive. And here's the best part. the world is starting to take notice. Because what's happening in Africa isn't just about Africa. It's a lesson for the rest of the world. That true independence comes from within, and respect between nations isn't optional. It's essential. It's simple. Africa is standing up for itself, and it's about time. Leaders like Traoré are proving that the days of being told to feel grateful are over. This is a new era, one where Africa isn't just surviving, it's thriving. Do you think now the Western leaders can say anything and get away with it? Why don't they respect other nations and expect respect in return? Let us know in the comments section. Will Macron apologize? Do you want to watch more videos like this one? If so, subscribe to our channel and press the bell icon next to it. We have decided to bring videos on something nobody talks about: the Black culture, civilization, history, and evidence about how glorious Blacks have been. Thanks for watching, and until the next video, stay tuned.